Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Sports Lock Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Mossaller. It's a pleasure having you back here today. Fantasy football is here. We are less than 2 months away from the preseason. People are starting to get ready for their drafts, and I'm going to be here along the way helping you prepare for your fantasy football draft. We're going to go division by division, breaking down each team, letting you know who I like and what are my rankings. So pretty much the next 8 weeks will go to the divisions, which will lead us right up until the end of preseason, where I will give you my rankings, sleepers, and bust podcast. You don't want to miss out on this. Make sure you follow along at Sports Luck Podcast on Instagram and TikTok in order to get up-to-date information on fantasy football for the 2024 season. You can check out last year's video, check out my rankings. I think they went pretty well. A lot of my sleepers, especially my quarterback sleeper last year, and Brock Purdy really went off. So we're hoping to do the same this year. And if you're watching here on YouTube, you can see this crazy AI image of the AFC North. I think it's pretty interesting. It's kind of morphed together. But with AI coming around, I thought, why not compile some sort of cool photo to post here on YouTube. So last year, the Ravens went 13-4, won the division. The Browns 11-6, second division. Third, the Steelers, they went 10-7, third in the division, and the Bengals 9-8. A very close battle and probably what is the most competitive division in the NFL. Last year, my predictions: the Bengals 12-4, finishing first, of course, 9-8, so a few games off there. The Ravens 10-7. I had them at, 10-7. The Ravens finished 13-4. The Steelers 9-8, finished 10-7, very close there. And the Browns 6-11 was my prediction. They end up going 11-6. They flipped it around. So I was pretty far off besides the Steelers last year as far as divisional standings. But all that really matters is fantasy football. And our first team we have here is the Baltimore Ravens, who won the division. They did end up losing the AFC Championship in a close one to Kansas City and went on to win the Super Bowl in overtime. But we'll take a look at their key additions to the 2024 season. And the big name that stands out is getting running back Derrick Henry. They've kind of bounced around with running back injuries over the last few years. J.K. Dobbins has not been able to be healthy, and they get one of the best backs in the league in Derrick Henry. I think it's a phenomenal fit. Obviously, you have Lamar Jackson, who's the running quarterback, and then you have Derrick Henry, who's the ground and pound guy. So between those two, this is going to be a dominant offense and one that's going to be hard to stop. So let's talk about that amazing quarterback in Lamar Jackson, who was the MVP last year. He finished QB4 with 24 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. He also ran for 821 yards, which was first amongst quarterbacks, and 5 touchdowns, which was tied for third. So what are my projections for this year? Well, I think they're going to look to run the ball more. Obviously, last year they said they wanted to pass the ball more, and that was the case. He did have 3,678 passing yards, which was a career high. But when you bring in Derrick Henry, you're going to look to give him the rock. So I do think that the passing numbers and the rushing numbers will come down slightly for Lamar Jackson. It's going to be more of a team offense there, but I still think he's good enough for QB5 in fantasy for now. ESPN also has him at QB5. So taking a little step back, but there were some injuries last year, some quarterbacks, and I do think with the addition of Derrick Henry, it pulls away from some of the fantasy numbers for Lamar Jackson. But still a quarterback you're going to want to draft in your draft. Next is running back Derrick Henry, obviously the beast from Tennessee, 8 seasons with Tennessee, a very good top running back in the league for those years. He finished RB8 last year with over 1,100 rushing yards, which was second amongst running backs, and 12 touchdowns, which was tied for fourth. Interesting enough, Derrick Henry has had over 1,000 rushing yards in 5 of the last 6 seasons. He only played 8 games in 2021, but he was very close to getting it, 937 yards. He could have had a career high there. and has double-digit touchdowns in all of his last 6 seasons. So the guy has been Mr. Consistent. The only problem is he's not as dominant in PPR leagues compared to non-PPR. So it varies where you draft him. I think overall in a PPR league, he's going to have over 1,000 yards on the ground in his double-digit touchdowns. I think he still gets there. And I have him as my RB10, same as ESPN. So agreeing with ESPN early. Again, a consistent guy, but if it's non-PPR, he's up the list. He's in the top 3 or 4. But in most leagues nowadays, it's PPR. So he drops a little bit further back to RB10. Again, I think he's right around his numbers last year, maybe a touchdown or two behind of what he had last year. Wide receiver we're going to talk about today is the big one last year, the rookie Zay Flowers. He led the Ravens wide receivers with 77 receptions, 858 yards, and 5 touchdowns, finished as the wide receiver 31. But his last 7 games, including the playoffs, he averaged almost 5 receptions and 6 yards per game, along with 5 touchdowns. So that's where he really blossomed last year, is at the end of the season. And at that pace, if he would have continued that the whole year, he would have finished inside the top 10. So he got that connection with Lamar Jackson there. Now, Flowers, no doubt, I think could be a sleeper to finish within the top 10. Just like we said, if he continues to do that, he's a top target for Lamar Jackson. I think that happens, but you have the return of the injured Mark Andrews and other options such as Rashad Bateman and Nelson Aguilar that are going to get the ball as well. Also, you got to look at Isaiah Likely, who got a lot of great playing time when Mark Andrews went down. He was a top tight end at the end of the season. So for me, it's wide receiver 20. I know it's cut off on the screen there. ESPN has wide receiver 25. Again, a little bit higher. I do think he keeps on a better track. I do think his touchdown numbers are going to be closer to 8 touchdowns this season. His receptions probably around 80. And there's no doubt I think that he's going to reach 1,000 yards. So a good wide receiver here that I like to draft on my team this season. Now, the tight ends, we have to go with both Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely. Andrews played in only 10 games last year, but still had 544 yards and 6 touchdowns. He finished as tight end 14, but was on pace to finish as tight end 7. So missing some games there and still produced. That is how good Mark Andrews is. But how about Isaiah Likely? He finished as tight end 23, but his last 5 games of the regular season, 282 yards and 5 touchdowns. Those are the games that Andrews did not play in. So he was just as dominant than when Mark Andrews was healthy. So what are the projections? Well, I think Likely is going to cut into Mark Andrews' load a little bit. I do think he gets some more playing time. We saw how great he was without Mark Andrews. I think they're going to try to pair these two together. And again, one of the most dominant offenses in the NFL as far as star power, in my opinion. So Andrews, for me, is still the guy, but I don't have him as high as ESPN because I do think Likely takes some snaps away from him. Andrews is my tight end 7. ESPN has him as tight end 3. Isaiah Likely, I'm a lot higher on. ESPN has him the whole way down at tight end 36. He's my tight end 20. Again, what's the injury like Mark Andrews going to be like? Obviously, he's had some issues here in the last 2 seasons. Does that linger on and continue? And do you like Isaiah Likely enough to give him the playing time? I think you do. And I think it's just disrespectful, ESPN, that you have Colby Parkinson, Ben Sinnott, and Daniel Bellinger ahead of Isaiah Likely, who last year finished tight end 23. So I know you expect Mark Andrews to be healthy, and that's what it's based on, but I'm not buying it. How about defense? Well, they're number 1 in fantasy last year, so you're going to want to draft them again. Although they lost Patrick Queen, they're still a great defense, one of the best offenses as well. Just a great team that possibly could go to the Super Bowl this year. Again, a stellar offense as a pro, and then they add Derrick Henry is incredible. I think the cons is they're playing in the toughest division in the NFL, which I said earlier. Which is going to be tough. You got to play those teams twice, the Browns, the Steelers, and the Bengals. So last year they went 13-4, projected 10-7. This year 12-5. I think they go one game worse. That's only because of the strength of schedule there. Let's move on to the Cincinnati Bengals, who finished last in the division at 9-8, which is insane, a winning record getting last. But really, it was all because of the injury bug that they had. Most predominantly, you talk about Joe Burrow, their quarterback. But they get some key additions this year. Running back Zach Moss after losing Joe Mixon, and they picked up tight end Mike Gesicki, which I think is a really big pickup from the Patriots. Now let's talk about Joe here, who had a wrist injury in 2023, and he is still recovering from that. He played in 10 games with 15 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. He was on pace to finish in the top 15, but really wasn't going to be too much of a threat. Now, I would be cautious with Joe this year. He is still lingering from that wrist injury. He's still not fully healthy from it. Yes, we expect that he will start the season, and if he is healthy, he can be dominant. But he's one of those guys you just have to be careful with. I certainly feel like he will improve, but I don't think he's going to be back to his 2021-22 numbers. I still have him as my QB 10, ESPN QB 8, so right around the same range. Obviously, those rankings could change before the season. I would just be leery on drafting Joe Burrow. If you're in a 10-man league, obviously, or a 12-man league, he should be going as one of the last quarterbacks, in my opinion. Again, could be good value at that place. However, I'm just going to be cautious with that injury. Talk about running back Zach Moss, coming from Indianapolis last year. He started in 8 games for the injured Jonathan Taylor, and when he was playing, he averaged 70 yards per game and 4 touchdowns. He was on pace for 1,100 yards, 8 touchdowns, which would have put him as the RB13. Now, Moss is no Joe Mixon. And obviously, this is going to be his first season with the Bengals. So how will he do? I don't know. He's got a guy named Chase Brown right behind him, going to be trying to get some playing time. But I do think that you take what he did last year when Jonathan Taylor wasn't playing and really put into numbers there that he is not a receiving back, but he will get the job done. And I do think those receiving numbers will improve with Joe Burrow there. He's my RB26, ESPN RB31. So again, he's going to be kind of a lower end RB2, mid-range RB2 with some upside there. Again, I have to look at what round he's going in. Could be some value there. That'll come a little bit later. But right now he's my RB26 compared to ESPN's RB31. Let's talk about Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. If not the best duo in the league, they're up there. Chase had another great season, but touchdowns were lower. He keeps going down in touchdowns. He went from 9 to 7. Still 100 receiving yards and over 1,200 100 receptions over 1,200 receiving yards, finished as a wide receiver 11, and that was with Joe Burrow missing some time. Higgins, on the other hand, he only played in 12 games, 656 yards and 5 touchdowns. He was on pace to finish as a wide receiver 36, so still not as good as where he was going last year. I will admit I was high on T. Higgins last year. It didn't pan out. Now, with Burrow healthy, I think Chase will get his touchdowns back up to double digits. I have no doubt about that. I don't know, Higgins, there was talk about him not starting the season. Obviously, he's got that contract, it looks like, under control. I'd still be cautious with drafting him, especially at his ADP. Right now, Chase is my wide receiver 4, ESPN wide receiver 3. I believe that out of the consensus top 3 in Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb, and I think that I have him above Justin Jefferson. And I might have Amon-Ra St. Brown right around there. But with your top wide receivers there, I do like him in the top 5. And I think that if you're picking somewhere in top 6, top 7 in fantasy, you have a chance to get Jamar Chase, which I would take at his ADP, because I think out of all the wide receivers every year, it's somebody different. I think Chase could be that guy. As far as T. Higgins, a little bit lower than ESPN on him. He's my wide receiver 34, ESPN wide receiver 28. Tight end Mike Gesicki. He had his 2 worst seasons coming in to Cincinnati this upcoming year. 2 touchdowns, 244 yards last year in New England. Goes from Miami, New England, now to Cincinnati. I think he can be featured a lot, though, in the passing game. Bengals tight ends have really struggled, though. So right now, I think he has upside as a pretty big sleeper for the tight end spot. He's my tight end 26. ESPN tight end 30, again, very low, but he's the starting tight end there. Maybe likely, and a couple other guys could reach up there as a backup tight end, but this guy's the starter, and you have him at tight end 38. I just don't like it. I think he's a big sleeper at his ADP. Am I going to draft him as my tight end 1? No, but as a backup tight end, if you're waiting later in drafts, I think he could be a big value. Defense was average. Some of the pros, they got healthy as a team coming into the season, which will help them. And the question is, I think with the con is, can the new pieces help improve the team? So we talked about Gesicki. We talked about Zach Moss. How will they be able to fit into this offense? And of course, their draft picks. Last year at 9-8, projected 12-4. I'm saying 11-6. I think they get 2 games better. I think they get their team healthy again. The defense improves. And again, tough division, tough schedule. But I do think if they went 9-8 last year with only 10 games of their quarterback in 12 games of T. Higgins, they'll win 2 games more. Next, we have the Cleveland Browns, 11-6, second in the division. They did get blown out in Houston last year, 45-14 in the divisional round. What do they do this year? They get some solid draft picks, and they add wide receiver Jerry Jeudy to the mix. Now, last year we had Joe Flacco going off with the injured Deshaun Watson, and he was a steal if you got him off waivers at the end of the season. But Watson, he only played in 6 games last year due to a shoulder injury, 7 touchdowns, 4 interceptions in those games. Not that great. If healthy, he was on pace to finish as QB 15. But he's a guy you got to be, there's a lot of caution with him too. He hasn't been healthy the last 2 seasons, still dealing with a shoulder injury, playing in a little amount of games. So with that being said, you got to, I think, be conservative with him. And he's my QB 21, ESPN a little bit higher at QB 17. Again, if healthy, he could easily be QB 10 or right around there. But I'm gonna take precaution with him. Probably not a guy that I'm going to be looking to draft in any of my leagues as my starter or backup. But a guy, if he falls to the waiver wire, you might want to keep an eye on. Running back Nick Chubb, we expect him to return sometime in the 2024 season. Obviously, that gruesome knee injury against Pittsburgh last year, which required the surgery, had him out for the year. Still not quite sure if he's going to start the season. I'm going to say probably not. And if that case, then Jerome Ford's the guy that you want. He had 813 yards and 9 total touchdowns last season. He was a great replacement and a great guy to pick up on waivers. So for me, I'm staying away from Nick Chubb no matter where. I just think he's a big risk with that knee injury. I don't know if he's going to come back full strength, and I think that if Ford plays as well as he did last year, it's going to cut into the playing time, and they're going to put a lot of precaution there on Nick Chubb. So if you're drafting Ford right now, he's going to RB 38 on ESPN. I have him right around there, one spot up at RB 37. Again, I think that this is going to change a lot coming up to the start of the season. I think there's a good chance that he could go a lot higher or lower, just depending on Chubb's injury designation going into the start of the season. So I would wait to see what Ford is going for here when we get closer to the start of the season. If I'm drafting now, I don't necessarily love taking Jerome Ford because we don't have enough information on Nick Chubb yet. But once we do know when he will be back, how many games he's going to miss, then I think that ADP will definitely change when we determine that. And then you might want to take the chance on Jerome Ford. Wide receiver Amari Cooper, he's the main guy. Obviously, we said they added Jerry Jeudy, but last year he finished as wide receiver 20, 72 receptions, over 1,200 receiving yards, and 5 touchdowns. Cooper did perform better with Flacco than Watson, so just throwing that out there. And Jerry Jeudy last year finished wide receiver 48. Now this year, I think he will decline a bit. They add Jeudy. Obviously, you have an amazing tight end who came alive last year at the end of the season, and David Njoku. So I think that contributes a little bit to that. So I think Jeudy does improve a little bit more because I think he's just going to be utilized in the offense a little bit more. So Cooper is my wide receiver 31. ESPN is kind of thinking along the same lines as me as wide receiver 32. Jeudy is their wide receiver 51. He's my wide receiver 48. So not too far off on the Cleveland Browns wide receivers. Tight end David Njoku, career high season, 81 receptions, 882 yards, and 6 touchdowns, finishes the tight end 6. Another guy who did better with Flacco, but he's always a good safety valve, and I think they saw how he went off and he can be utilized more. So I do see him as a big asset. However, ESPN has him as tight end 8. He's more of my tight end 10 for now. Obviously, that could change by the start of the season. Defense is top 5, which should help them stay competitive in a very tough division, but finishing second means you have a tougher schedule. And the cons are you might not have your best running back in Chubb, and you have a banged up Deshaun Watson still the last 2 seasons. So last year, 11-6, people are really high in the Browns this year. I am the opposite. I'm going 5-12, which I think sounds insane. And when I'm reading this, I think those numbers are going to be way off. I think they're going to be closer to 500. But again, a very tough schedule. And can this team stay healthy? They're not fully healthy right now. Can they stay that way? That's the big question. How about lastly, the Pittsburgh Steelers? My team finished 10-7, third in the division, lost to Kansas City in the divisional round, 31-17. But they went out and made some big moves this offseason, signing Russell Wilson, signing Justin Fields, and Patrick Queen. They add 2 great quarterbacks, and I know you look at it and think, are they really that great? Well, when you had Kenny Pickett as your starter, Mason Rudolph behind him, and Mitchell Trubisky, those 2 are big additions for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Right now, Russell Wilson is the starter, but they could battle it out in camp, and if that's the case, Justin Fields does have a chance to play. But we're going in as Wilson being the starter. They signed him to do so. Finished QB 14 last year, too, with over 3,000 passing yards, 26 touchdowns, which was 8th best amongst quarterbacks, and 8 interceptions. Also, Justin Fields, QB 18. So what a punch with those 2 quarterbacks. Now, Russell Wilson, I think ESPN is very low on. They have him at QB 30. Now, I do think that they think Justin Fields will take some time away for Russell Wilson, which could be the case. However, Russell Wilson was QB 14 last year with the Broncos, who, in my opinion, were a worse overall team. So bringing him in and saying that he's going to finish the whole way at QB 30, I think is ridiculous. I think conservatively, he's QB 24, but he has QB 15 upside in my opinion. Again, a guy that I don't think is going to be drafted unless we have Steelers fans drafting, but a guy you want to monitor on the waivers. Running backs, dual threat. Najee Harris, Jaylen Warren. Now, they were identical last year with less than 1 fantasy point between the 2. Warren, RB22, Najee, RB23. Najee still rushed for over 1,000 yards and had 8 touchdowns, but Warren was the receiving back. So in PPR, he was better. Najee, non-PPR, was better. But he had 30 more receptions than Najee, Jaylen Warren did. So what's going to happen this year? I think they're going to utilize both backs again. I think Najee will be the main back, but they will bring Jaylen Warren in. It might be kind of like a Green Bay Packers situation where you have Aaron Jones last year with A.J. Dillon, and I think that they might just split series. If that's the case, with the upgraded O-line, I think that both will finish right around the same. I do have Najee slightly higher. He's my RB24 compared to RB27 of ESPN. ESPN has Warren 1 ahead at RB26. I'm going to keep Warren there at my RB26, but again, just move Najee Harris up a little bit more. Wide receiver George Pickens. He is really the best wide receiver in what is probably the worst wide receiver core in the NFL this year. Still early. They could trade. I know there's rumors Brandon Ayuk could be in the mix, would be huge. But for now, it's George Pickens, who finished wide receiver 30, still finishing with over 1,100 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns. And of course, this was with Deontay Johnson being the wide receiver 1 on the team last year and the terrible Kenny Pickett. on the offensive, leading the offense, I should say. Van Jefferson, Roman Wilson, the draft pick this year, are kind of co-wide receiver twos. I like Roman Wilson a little more than Van Jefferson. I think the Wilson to Wilson combo will be pretty tough. But for now, I have huge expectations for George Pickens. I think he has a breakout year with the upgraded O-line, the upgraded quarterback. He's my wide receiver 21, but I think he could easily finish as wide receiver 15. ESPN's a lot lower at wide receiver 29. So I am a lot higher on George Pickens. I think he is a big sleeper candidate, and he is a solid wide receiver 2, in my opinion, with potential wide receiver 1 upside. Lastly, tight end Pat Freiermuth. He played in 12 games last year, 32 receptions, 308 yards, and 2 touchdowns, which was best for tight end 28. If he was healthy, he was on pace to finish tight end 18. Obviously, the year prior, he had a lot better season than he did last year, so he went downhill. What will he do this year? Well, I think he's definitely a top 15 tight end when healthy. He's my tight end 14, ESPN tight end 16. So, again, a guy that's probably going to be a backup. But if you're a Steeler fan, you'll probably look to draft him as your starting tight end. Their defense is top 10. They did improve with, of course, in the draft and signing Patrick Queen. A huge QB upgrade, and the offensive line upgrades as well is huge for the pros. But the cons are that they have the toughest schedule in the NFL that starts off easy, but it ends terribly. So if they don't get off to a good start, it won't be good. Now, last year they were 10-7. I projected 9-8. I think Tomlin has another winning season, but it's 9-8. And again, they look a lot better than they do last year. But the Steelers, no matter how good they are, somehow just barely get over 500. And with that very tough schedule, I'm comfortable putting them at 9-8. So here are my sleepers and busts for the AFC North. We talk about quarterback Russell Wilson, obviously as QB 30 for ESPN. I think he has much more upside, especially coming in as the QB 14 from last year. Jerome Ford, he could be a sleeper. I think that he will play more. I think that Chubb's injury is going to linger on him even if he does play this season. So I kind of like Jerome Ford there. Wide receiver Zay Flowers, I said at the beginning of the podcast, I do think he's underrated there the way that he ended the season. I think he can continue on that pace. Wide receiver George Pickens, we just talked about. I think he has a lot of upside with the quarterback upgrade and being the wide receiver 1 now. Tight end Isaiah Likely, a huge sleeper, especially if you're going to put him at tight end 36. I just think that's ridiculous. And tight end Mike Gesicki, kind of the same way. Tight end 38, I think he has a lot higher upside as well. The only 2 busts that I really see this year in the AFC North would be Deshaun Watson. I do think that they're putting him a little bit higher. They're putting him at what he would have finished if he was healthy last season. He still really isn't healthy. So if he's missing time, I do think that he will be lower than what ESPN has. Finally, T. Higgins, I just think there's a lot going on with the contract. I know he did sign, but I just think there's a lot going on there. So I would stay away from him at that ADP. This year, again, just going over what I have the standings at. The Ravens first at 12-5, the Bengals second at 11-6, the Steelers third at 9-8, and the Browns at a whopping 5-12, which will probably be the most controversial pick there. And I might not even be 100% with it, but I do think that they will be closer to under 500 than they are over 500. So that's the first podcast of the season. Thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube at Sports Lock Podcast, as well as follow me on Instagram and TikTok, where you can find more content over there. Again, I will be posting weekly videos now, breaking down the divisions in each team, getting you ready for the upcoming 2024 fantasy football season. I'm excited for it. It means we're getting closer, roughly about 10 weeks away. So I'm excited. Thanks again for listening in and watching. We'll see you next Wednesday evening for the AFC South Divisional Preview. Have a good one.